Welcome back to Chinese religion. In part 12, the last video in the series, we're going to look at religion during the Qing Dynasty, the Republic of China, and the People's Republic of China. The Qing Dynasty was established in 1644 by the Manchus. This is the last imperial dynasty of China. The Manchus were not ethnically Chinese or Han. They were a nomadic people from Manchuria, similar in culture and lifestyle, at least initially, to the Mongols. And they likewise invaded China and established their own dynasty or empire. Vajrayana was the state religion because that was the type of Buddhism that they had practiced. However, the Manchus essentially set up an administration very similar to that of the Ming Dynasty. So Confucianism was still used for both government rituals and for the imperial examination system. You can see also the territory of the Qing Dynasty was much expanded over that of the Ming. So they included in their territory Outer and Inner Mongolia, Tibet, and what's now known as Xinjiang or East Turkestan in the west, as well as their homeland in Manchuria. The Qing Dynasty, even though it lasted for many centuries, it eventually fell into decline in the 19th century. One factor in this was a war fought between the Qing and United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. This is called the Opium War. The reasons for this war are complex, but essentially, Great Britain profited off of selling opium in China, and that they wanted their merchants to be able to sell opium there. That was one of the main ways that they bought coveted Chinese goods, such as porcelain and silk. And the Chinese were reluctant to allow opium to be sold in China because of the horrible social effects it was having on the people who were addicted to it. However, Britain essentially fought a war, beat the Chinese military, and forced them to allow British merchants to sell this harmful drug, opium, in their country. It was a great humiliation of China. Throughout virtually all of its history, the Chinese emperors or kings had regarded themselves as the center of the civilization, the most powerful country in the world, most important culture in the world. And this was the first time they had really been kind of systematically defeated or shown up by a foreign power. So it kind of caused some people in China to argue for a reform of the society. There was another somewhat humiliating defeat in the Sino-Japanese War in 1894 to 1895. Japan was always regarded as a kind of vassal state, someone who could pay the emperor tribute. Japan was a younger country. They had borrowed a lot of their own culture, some of their writing system, some of their religion, philosophy, etc. from China. Even some of the customs of the Japanese emperors owe, at least in part, to influence by earlier Chinese dynasties. And so it was a humiliation that Japan had modernized under Western influence in the late 19th century. In addition to industrializing, they created a modern military that was able to defeat China and enact concessions. So one example of a reformer during the end of the Qing dynasty was Gang You. So he looked at the example of Japan, how Japan had rapidly modernized, industrialized, and made themselves a force to be reckoned with, and thought that something similar could be done in China. But he also saw in the case of Japan that the religion of Shinto is being converted into a kind of nationalistic or patriotic religion. So this is something that's covered in the Japanese religion videos, but Shinto was used in this period as what's called state Shinto. It was promoted by the government, especially the emperor of Japan was worshipped as a kami or spirit. And the idea is all Japanese people should worship that emperor and thus serve as a basis for national unity, regardless of what other religion they might have. And so Gang You thought perhaps Confucianism, which was an indigenous tradition in China that was partially a philosophy, could serve as a basis for national unity in China if it was promoted by the government in the right way, similar to how Shinto is being used during this period in Japan. Gang You was also critical of Buddhism. Buddhism at this point was associated with superstitions and the afterlife. So Buddhism was primarily about praying to these beings so that you or your ancestors could have a better rebirth in the next life. And Buddhism also had these elaborate cosmologies of different heavens, hells, other worlds different types of spirits and all kinds of beings. And so people who were modernizers often looked down on Buddhism during this period. The Republic of China was established in 1912. Essentially, the last of the Qing emperors was forced out and a republic was declared. This is a republic that had a representative government, at least to a certain extent, modeled along the lines of Western liberal democracy. Sun Yat-sen was regarded as the founding father of the Republic of China, or the ROC. So Sun Yat-sen, even though he was basically very influenced by Western liberal democracies in founding or helping to found the Republic of China, was also trying to deliberately create connections between the new system and traditional Chinese culture. So for example, he looked at the Confucian Meng Tse and also the Neo-Confucian Shen Yi to look for precedents for the idea of democracy. Even though Meng Tse didn't argue directly for democracy, he did argue that rulers must rule for the benefit of the people and to a certain extent take their needs and requests and desires into account, and that this would go hand in hand with making the country stronger as well. For his part, Sun Yat-sen advocated three principles that should guide the new republic: nationalism, citizen rights, and human welfare. And it's interesting because even though he was looking for earlier Confucian precedents to the new Republic of China, these principles all sound very Western. Nationalism really had its start, as we know it today, in France around the time of the French Revolution, the late 1700s, where the idea was people should identify not with their social class or with their religion, but rather with their ethnic identity as determined primarily by their native language, in that case French. That principle spread to other European countries and eventually it would spread to China. And then another principle was citizen rights or human rights and human welfare. So human welfare did have precedence in Chinese culture, both in Mo Tse and Confucians like Meng Tse, but the spin on it overall was influenced by Western political thought as well in the Republic of China. The People's Republic of China, or the PRC, was established in 1949, and there was a lot of history that happened between the beginning of the Republic of China in 1912 and the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. So in that intervening period, there was a Japanese invasion and occupation of parts of China, especially in the east. At the same time as the Japanese aggression, there was a civil war in China. There were both rebel groups that had been fighting ever since the decline of the Qing, but there were also the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, or KMT, and the Communists, or the CPC, as they're both abbreviated. And that was the main parties in the Civil War. The Communists eventually defeated the Nationalists in 1949. This was after Japan had been defeated by the United States in 1945. Their unconditional surrender meant that the Japanese forces in China all left. And so after 1945, that actually intensified the civil war between the Nationalists and the Communists before the Communists attained their final victory in 1949. So in that same year, the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, was established on mainland China by the Communists. The Nationalists did not totally go away. They fled the mainland China for the southern island of Taiwan, where they established or continued the Republic of China, which they regard as the legitimate successor to the original Republic of China founded in 1912 in the mainland. And the Republic of China thus continues on the island of Taiwan to this day. It's a very sensitive issue whether Taiwan is a part of China. So you could say de facto, or practically speaking, Taiwan has its own government. And that's not something that's directly controlled by the People's Republic of China. However, the PRC regards Taiwan as part of their territory. The reason why this is all relevant to religion is because the communist ideology meant that religion was suppressed to a large extent on the mainland under the rule of the PRC, but it was allowed to flourish more. The traditional Chinese religion survived more in Taiwan and in other places such as Hong Kong that were not controlled by the PRC. And there's a picture of Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the communists and the founder of the People's Republic of China. So let's talk a bit more about religion in the People's Republic of China. So communism was the official ideology of the PRC. And this ideology, based on the thought of Karl Marx, is atheist, materialist, determinist, and egalitarian. So it's egalitarian in the sense that communism essentially is advocating a vision of a society where everyone is equal in terms of their resources, at least in the ideal case. Marx was kind of vague on the details, but the idea seems to be in the communist ideal society, you could basically have leisure to pursue any activity you wanted when you wanted to do it. And you'd be working part of the time, but you wouldn't be a kind of wage slave where you have to work just to sustain yourself. So it's almost like the life of an aristocrat traditionally, but Marx thought everyone should have the opportunity to experience that life of leisure and occasional work that wasn't burdensome. Communist ideology was also deterministic because they thought there was a logic to history where things would happen inevitably according to a certain, not really a plan of God or anything, but just a natural cause and effect of the material conditions of society as he saw it. So for instance, Karl Marx and his followers regarded the communist revolution as inevitable, and that would eventually take over the whole industrialized world. And then the two last parts of the ideology, the materialism and the atheism, are especially relevant to religion. So Karl Marx was a materialist, so was communism a materialist ideology. There's no such thing as gods or spirits on this view. Karl Marx regarded religion as an opium of the masses that does give them psychological comfort on the one hand because of hope of a better tomorrow, better afterlife, etc. But it actually does not improve their material condition for the most part and prevents them from organizing against the ruling class to demand superior material resources or superior access to material resources in the here and now. And communism is also atheist because it denies the existence of God. Well, the atheism and the materialism of the communist ideology, the PRC, definitely meant that they were not sympathetic with any religion, including the traditional Chinese religions of Buddhism, Confucianism, Daoism, and the folk religion. So religion was not completely outlawed, but it was suppressed, and it was especially attacked during what's known in the West as the Cultural Revolution, which lasted from 1966 to 1976. This was initiated by Mao Zedong, and the thinking seems to be as he thought that in order for the communist revolution to be complete, it was not enough for the institutions, the political institutions, to be controlled by communists, because as long as the people still had outdated non-communist ideas and beliefs in their minds and in their culture, the society would not truly be communist. So it was literally an attempt to get rid of everything that was in conflict with communism, both in terms of material things like temples and icons or idols. You can see them being destroyed on the right, but also in people's minds. So any trace of non-communist ideology like religious beliefs was regarded as a potential problem or a threat. And a lot of people were killed during this period. That included clergy of those religions. People were forcibly kicked out of their religion. So priests or monks might be forced to work on farms or in factories instead of practicing their religion, etc. There was frankly a lot of repression and destruction of religions and religious artifacts, historical monuments, etc. So this was more or less put to an end after the death of Mao Zedong, and the successor of Mao Zedong as head of the PRC was Deng Xiaoping. Now, Deng Xiaoping was a communist. He definitely believed in the ideology, but as he put it, I don't care whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. So his thinking was to prioritize lifting people out of poverty, including the common people, by growing the economy. And it was okay to compromise some communist principles, both in economics and politics, in order to do this. So he allowed, for example, some private ownership of property. The reforms of Deng Xiaoping really helped set the stage for the tremendous growth of the Chinese economy over the last several decades. None of that would have been possible without Deng Xiaoping's reforms. He also kind of loosened up the restrictions on religion that had developed in the Cultural Revolution. Now, religious freedom is permitted under the law of the People's Republic of China in theory, but in practice there is some control over the religions. There are 5 religions that are officially recognized: Buddhism, Daoism, Roman Catholic Christianity, Protestant Christianity, and Islam. So other religious groups are not given official recognition by the government. At least in theory, if you're going to be religious, you have to be one of those 5. Also, the government does control certain religious organizations. They don't allow the Pope, for example, to appoint bishops in China. They're really worried about religions drawing people's authority away from the government or having them be troublemakers. In part, you can understand that based on the communist ideology of wanting a lot of control of society, but it's more than that. If you look at the history of China, Historically, there have been a lot of religious groups and movements that end up becoming rebels against the government, like the White Lotus Society, for example. Um, and so the Catholic Church has bishops that are appointed by the PRC. These are not necessarily officially recognized by the Catholic Church, but the Chinese Catholic Church is expected to follow the bishops appointed by the government. There's also some government control over the appointment of lamas and other Buddhist teachers, and certain religions like Falun Gong are just outlawed by the government and the PRC. So let's talk about Confucianism. Despite the fact that Confucianism was really attacked during the Cultural Revolution, it was thought of as a kind of relic from earlier Chinese history, one that emphasized patriarchy, that emphasized hierarchy, inequality, belief in spirits. It was at odds with communist ideology, so it was definitely suppressed and attacked by Mao, who thought it was something that was really deeply ingrained in the culture that had to be eradicated. But things have changed in the last couple of decades. Confucianism is seen by some in the ruling class of the PRC as a kind of authentically Chinese ideology or system of thought that could serve as an alternative to the Western style values of individualism, liberalism, capitalism, and democracy. So this could be a way of promoting a value system that creates stability and order in society, gives people a sense of meaning and purpose, contributing to the greater good, but is rooted in Chinese tradition. So in part, this is why there have been government sponsorship of Confucianism. You can see that in these official celebrations of Confucius' birthday that are held throughout the country. In part, this is also because in recent decades, just the PRC has become a bigger promoter of traditional Chinese culture, and that would include Confucianism as well as other things. It doesn't attack it like it used to during the Cultural Revolution. There's also these things called the Confucius Foundation, which is a government-sponsored kind of like an academy or think tank for the study of Confucianism, and the Confucius Institutes in other countries. Now, these are ostensibly created to spread knowledge of Confucian philosophy to other countries. I've read that they actually operate as kind of like an attempt at positive propaganda or soft power for the PRC to create a positive impression of itself and just Chinese culture in other countries. Here's a picture from the Confucius Institute in Auburn University in Alabama in the United States. Some of these Confucius Institutes have been shut down because of criticisms that they were kind of more of like a diplomatic or a propaganda move than like a serious attempt at scholarship, but some of them still remain. In addition to the great revival of Confucianism that's happened in the past couple of decades in the People's Republic of China, we should talk about the history of Daoism in the last 100 years or so. So Daoism was very influential in what's called in the West the Boxer Rebellion that lasted from 1899 to 1901. In Chinese, this was called Yi He Chuan, or the Righteous and Harmonious Fist. That was the name of the people who led this rebellion. Even though the Qing Dynasty was in control of China, a lot of Western foreign powers had gained influence and kind of spheres of control over parts of China. For example, there were spheres of extraterritoriality in which if a Westerner committed a crime in a Chinese city, they were not subject to the laws of China. They were allowed to be tried in their own courts. And there were even, my understanding is like soldiers from Western countries that were billeted or stationed in China. So that was regarded by many Chinese as a great affront to their sovereignty and to their dignity. The Yi He Chuan were basically uprising against the Westerners, trying to defeat them and kick them out. And it was actually a religious movement influenced by Daoism and Chinese folk religion. So the people who were leading this rebellion were martial artists from martial arts schools that practiced, they thought their cultivation of qi gave them kind of miraculous powers, the power to stop bullets. Well, needless to say, that did not actually work out in the event. They were defeated by Western armies, and after this incident, it really hurt the prestige of Daoism, at least for a time. There were reformers in China who were saying, both after the Opium Wars and especially after the Boxer Rebellion, look, Daoism with all this talk of qi and miracles is just a bunch of superstitious nonsense. It's part of the past. We need to get rid of this to reform society. Despite those critiques, Daoism actually, and just traditional Chinese religion, and things like traditional Chinese medicine that's based in part on qi theory, like you see that in acupuncture, they remained all of these things very prominent in Chinese culture. So even forms of martial arts like Tai Chi Chuan, that are based on Qi theory. Tai Chi Chuan can be both an exercise when it's done in a slowed down meditative way, but it also is connected to a traditional martial art that just basically has sped up versions of the forms. This is still very prominent in Chinese culture and is spread to the West, indeed, in other cultures. Another example of this continued influence of the Taoist tradition of Qi theory is Qigong. Now, this is not a Taoist sect. It's a modern movement that combines a bunch of different techniques for cultivating Qi. Breathing exercises, meditation, stretching, etc. But it's definitely influenced by the Taoist tradition of self-cultivation. And you can also see continued Taoist influence on the more diffuse folk religion that is still widely practiced in the PRC, even among people who don't really consider themselves religious. One example of this is the 8 Immortals. These were legendary human sages who were regarded as having attained immortality, basically through following a Taoist path of self-cultivation. And, worshiping them isn't like super common, but you can see images of them, paintings, very common in China, even if just used for decoration. And now let's talk about Buddhism in the last century or two. So Dan Zedong was a Buddhist, a reformer, who was looking at connections between Buddhism and other religions. He was trying to, in a sense, demystify Buddhism, make it less focused on belief in other worlds, gods, spirits, and the afterlife, but rather on ethics. So he said that the Buddhist notion of karuna, or compassion, is the same basic idea as the Confucian idea of ren, or humaneness, and even the ancient Moist idea of jin ai, or impartial caring. And it's also, he connected it to the Christian idea of agape, or love for all humans. And so this is a way of comparing Buddhism to other great ethical religions and showing it as a kind of path that uplifts you morally and connects you to other beings through love and compassion for them. He also connected to this idea of the ethics of Buddhist compassion to the Mahayana doctrine of the interconnectedness or oneness of all things. And this idea is probably very common in modern Buddhist circles, including in the West, but it was an innovation for the time. The idea of connecting to the Mahayana metaphysical or cosmological doctrine of interconnectedness with the ethical doctrine of universal compassion, somewhat of an innovation. Another example of an innovator or reformer of Chinese Buddhism was Daishu, shown here on the right. He regarded Buddhism as actually the religion most compatible with modern science. So he tried to flip the narrative on people who were criticizing Buddhism as mired in outdated superstitions. And he really marks himself off as a modernist Buddhist, so someone who practiced Buddhist modernism that we saw in the Buddhism videos where we talked about the history of Buddhism. You can see this attempt to portray Buddhism as uniquely compatible with science, emphasizing the aspects of Buddhism that are not supernatural, but rather are about the cultivation of consciousness. So emphasizing the psychological and the ethical aspects of Buddhism over belief in ghosts, gods, and the afterlife. And so this approach to Buddhism in China is called Renjian Fojiao, or Humanistic Buddhism. And it was heavily influenced by Daishu, but it continues under other teachers and reformers to this day. So this type of Buddhism emphasizes education, social work, other types of volunteering for the sake of public welfare, and also engagement in politics to try to make society better. So it's less focused on having a good afterlife and more focused on making the world a better place. So let's talk some more about Renjian Fojiao, specifically some humanistic Buddhist associations that are still active today. So even though Buddhism, like other religions, was suppressed in the People's Republic of China after 1949, it actually flourished in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and in other parts of Southeast Asia and the United States that had large overseas Chinese communities. So one example of this is the Chinese Buddhist Association. This had originally been founded in Shanghai in 1929. So this is before the PRC was established in 1949. But after the PRC was established, it moved to Taiwan in 1950 because it had greater freedom to operate there. There was greater religious freedom. Another example of a prominent humanistic Buddhist organization is Fo Guangshan, or Buddha's Light Mountain in Chinese. This is an example of modern schools of Buddhism or sects that are syncretic. that are combining teachings from multiple of the traditional sects of Chinese Buddhism. So Fo Guangshan does not identify as either Jingtu, Pure Land, or Chan, meditation, or Tian Tai. It incorporates ideas from all of those schools and other, even of the more ancient Chinese schools as well, that were popular before the Tang Dynasty. So Fo Guangshan in particular focuses on education as part of its mission. So you can see the idea of outreach to society. An example of this in the United States, and actually locally where I'm at now, Southern California, is the University of the West, which is operated by Fo Guangshan in Rosemead, California. Now, they do have, I think, a degree program in Buddhist studies. I think they even provide scholarships for students who major in Buddhist studies to help study Buddhism, but they have a bunch of other degree programs as well, such as nursing, that are not directly related to Buddhism as such. Another example of their influence internationally is Shilai Temple, also in Southern California in Hacienda Heights. This is one of the largest, if not the largest, Buddhist temple outside of Asia, and it's actually on the side of a mountain. It affords a great view of San Gabriel Valley. So a lot of people go there just as tourists, but they definitely created it with an idea to not only having Buddhists go there to worship, but as a kind of place that could be open, at least for visiting, by all members of the public. Another humanistic Buddhist organization is called Tzu Chi, or Compassionate Relief. This was founded by the nun Cheng Yan, shown on the right, and this organization focuses on charity, acts of goodwill for the sick and the poor, and also on education. So they run primary schools. For an example, there's one, a Tzu Chi school in Monrovia, California, to take another local example. So this shows the kind of continuing relevance of humanistic Buddhism. It's more prominent probably in Taiwan and Hong Kong and overseas Chinese communities than in the PRC itself, but you can find it there as well.